April 1945. The stone walls of a requisitioned hospital in Saxony hold the smell of carbolic acid, blood, and despair. Outside, the thunder of distant artillery rolls across the Elbe Valley like an approaching storm. Inside, beneath vaulted ceilings blackened by years of inadequate heating, German nurses move through dimly lit corridors with practiced efficiency, their wooden clogs echoing against floors worn smooth by 1,000 urgent footsteps. They are pale, these women, their faces drawn tight by hunger and exhaustion. Their aprons, once white, have been washed and re-washed until the fabric has turned the color of old bone. Some are barely 20 years old. Others are grandmothers pressed back into service as younger women were consumed by the war machine's insatiable appetite. They change dressings with hands that tremble not from fear but from malnutrition. They hold the hands of dying boys who call out for mothers who may already be dead beneath the rubble of Berlin, or Dresden, or Cologne. And they do this without anesthetic, without proper bandages, without hope. The war is ending. Everyone knows this now, though no one dares speak it aloud where the wrong ears might hear. The Reich that was promised to last 1,000 years is collapsing like a house built on sand, and these nurses stand in the crumbling doorway between one world and whatever comes next. They have been told for years what to expect from the enemy. The Americans, they were warned, are barbarians despite their wealth. Mongrelized, corrupted by Jewish influence and Negro music. They will come with violence and vengeance. They will take what they want. The propaganda ministry has been quite clear about this. And so these nurses prepare themselves not for liberation, but for another kind of suffering, even as they hear the engines of American tanks growling closer, even as they see the first reconnaissance jeeps appearing on the muddy roads that wind through the spring. Countryside, then the Americans arrive. They come not with the fury of conquerors, but with something the nurses cannot immediately comprehend. They come with trucks loaded not just with weapons, but with crates of supplies, medical supplies, food, and then, impossibly, one young soldier, a private from Ohio with red hair and freckles, who looks absurdly young himself, reaches into his pack and pulls out a small bottle. Glass, elegant. It catches the weak April sunlight filtering through the hospital's broken windows. He holds it out to Sister Margaret, a 40-year-old nurse who has not smiled in 3 years, whose husband was killed at Stalingrad, and whose son disappeared in the Ardennes. He holds out this bottle of perfume, actual perfume, French perfume, Chanel or perhaps Lanvin, and places it gently in her work-roughened hands. She stares at it. She cannot speak. Behind her, the other nurses have stopped their work. They stand frozen, watching this incomprehensible transaction. The soldier smiles, tips his helmet, and walks away to help unload plasma and morphine and chocolate bars and cigarettes and condensed milk and all the abundance of a nation that has not known hunger, has not known its cities turned to ash. Sister Margaret looks down at the perfume bottle in her hands and begins to weep. This is not how it was supposed to be. To understand the profound shock of this moment, one must first understand the chasm between expectation and reality, between the mythology that sustained the Third Reich and the truth that arrived on American trucks in the spring of 1945, the German nurses who encountered American soldiers in those final, chaotic weeks of the European war had been shaped by a decade of carefully constructed propaganda, by years of privation, and by the deep trauma of serving in a medical system that had become a charnel house. They had been told a story about themselves and about their enemies. The perfume bottle shattered that story as surely as Allied bombs had shattered German cities. The Third Reich had built its identity on narratives of superiority and struggle. The German people, they were told, were engaged in a heroic fight for living space, for cultural preservation, for racial purity against inferior and decadent enemies. The Bolsheviks to the east were Asiatic hordes, the British were effete imperialists, and the Americans were perhaps the most contemptible of all. They were soft, materialistic, a nation without true culture, a hodgepodge of races and immigrants lacking the blood purity and ancestral connection to soil that made a people great. They were rich, yes, but their wealth had made them weak. They preferred jazz and Hollywood to Wagner and Goethe. They elevated commerce over honor, comfort over sacrifice. When war came, the propaganda insisted these pampered Americans would break against German discipline and fighting spirit. The nurses had believed this, or at least they had tried to believe it. Belief was safer than doubt, and for a time the victories seemed to confirm it. France fell in 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht rolled across Europe like an iron tide. German soldiers sent letters home describing their conquests with the casual confidence of men who could not imagine losing. The nurses working in military hospitals saw the wounded but also saw the triumph. They saw men who had marched to Paris, who had stood at the Atlantic, who had pushed deep into Russia. Even when the tide began to turn, even when the letters from the East became darker and more desperate, even when the wounded came back with frostbite and the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen things that could not be spoken, even then, the official narrative held. The Americans, when they finally entered the war, would not change anything. They could make equipment, perhaps, but they could not make warriors. Then came the battles in North Africa, and the Americans learned. Sicily, and they learned. Normandy, and they came ashore with a power that made the earth shake. The nurses began to hear different stories from the wounded now. Stories about American artillery that fell like apocalyptic rain. More shells in a single barrage than the Wehrmacht could fire in a week. Stories about American tanks that seemed to multiply like locusts. Fresh columns appearing no matter how many were destroyed. Stories about American supply lines that never faltered. About American soldiers who were somehow always well-fed, well-armed, their uniforms clean, their equipment new. Stories that contradicted everything the nurses had been taught to believe. But stories could be dismissed. Direct experience could not. Sister Anna Hoffman, who worked in a surgical unit near Leipzig, would later write in her diary about the moment the Americans took her hospital. She had expected brutality. She had hidden her small cache of personal items, a silver locket with her mother's picture, a prayer book, a single piece of chocolate she had been saving for 2 years, beneath a loose floorboard. She had warned the younger nurses to stay together, to avoid being alone with the enemy soldiers. She had steeled herself for whatever was to come. The Americans arrived on a Tuesday morning. They came with a medical officer, a captain who spoke German with a slight accent. He was polite. He asked about their supplies. When Sister Hoffman explained that they had run out of morphine days ago, that they were using boiled fabric for bandages, that their last shipment of medications had never arrived, the captain nodded and made notes on a clipboard. 2 hours later, American orderlies began bringing in boxes, morphine, sulfa drugs, proper bandages, surgical thread, plasma for transfusions, disinfectant, and then, almost as an afterthought, one of the orderlies produced a cardboard box filled with what he called morale supplies. Inside were bars of soap that smelled like lavender, tins of hand cream, lipstick, and perfume, small bottles of it, enough for each nurse. Sister Hoffman held the soap to her face and inhaled. She had forgotten that soap could smell like anything other than harsh lye. She had forgotten that there were things in the world made purely to bring small pleasures, small moments of beauty in the midst of ugliness. She sat down on the edge of a hospital bed and cried until her shoulders shook. And when one of the American soldiers asked if she was all right, she could only nod because she had no words for what she was feeling. The perfume was not merely perfume. It was evidence of a reality that undermined everything the Reich had promised. It was proof that the Americans were not weakened by their abundance but empowered by it. It was a demonstration of a kind of power that the Third Reich had never understood and could never match. Not the power to destroy, though the Americans had proven themselves more than capable of that, but the power to create, to produce, to distribute, to waste resources on things that had no military value whatsoever, simply because they could, because they had so much that even their generosity could be careless. The German nurses had been living on rations that decreased month by month. Their soap was rationed. Their food was rationed. Everything was rationed, controlled, distributed according to bureaucratic formulas designed to extract maximum output from a population slowly starving. The concept of surplus was alien to them now. Every potato was counted. Every gram of fat was precious. They darned their stockings until there was more darning than stocking. They cut their hair short not for fashion, but to save on the shampoo they no longer had. They learned to identify which wounded soldiers would likely die so that morphine would not be wasted on them. Efficiency, conservation, sacrifice. These were the watchwords of the Reich's final years, and then came the Americans with their perfume. Private First Class Robert Chen from San Francisco would not have understood the symbolic weight of the bottle he handed to a German nurse outside Weimar. To him, it was just something his sister had sent in a care package. and he had carried it for 2 months without knowing what to do with it. His sister worked at a department store in Union Square, and she had access to the cosmetics counter, and she thought maybe Bobby could give it to a French girl when he helped liberate Paris. But Bobby's unit had not gone through Paris. They had gone through the Hurtgen forest and the Battle of the Bulge and across the Rhine, and by the time they were deep in Germany, the perfume bottle had become a kind of talisman, a reminder that a world existed where women wore perfume, where department stores had cosmetics counters, where his sister went to work every day in a city that had never been bombed. When he saw the German nurses, exhausted and skeletal, he remembered his sister. That was all. It seemed like the right thing to do. He did not know that the nurse he gave it to, Sister Greta Weiss, had not owned perfume in 7 years. He did not know that before the war she had been an art student in Munich, that she had loved impressionist paintings and café society, and the feeling of wearing a beautiful dress. He did not know that the National Socialist Party had shut down her art school and redirected her to nursing training, because the Reich needed nurses, not artists. He did not know that she had volunteered for this work with genuine idealism, believing that she was serving a noble cause, that she was part of something great and historical. He did not know how slowly that idealism had curdled into disillusionment as she watched boys die for a war that made less sense with each passing month. Private Chen simply held out the bottle, smiled awkwardly and said, "For you, miss." Sister Weiss took it with shaking hands. She opened it later, alone in a storage room. The scent of roses and jasmine and something else she could not identify flooded her senses. She had a memory, sudden and overwhelming, of being 19 years old and walking through the Englischer Garten on a summer evening, wearing a yellow dress, laughing at something a boy had said, the whole world ahead of her, everything possible. She closed the bottle and hid it under her pillow. She could not bring herself to use it. It was too precious. It was evidence that the world she had lost might still exist somewhere. This scene, or variations of it, repeated itself across Germany in those weeks as the American army pushed east. The pattern was consistent enough that it appeared in dozens of personal accounts, in letters, in diaries, in the memoirs that some of these nurses would write decades later. American soldiers, often without any official directive, giving small gifts to German medical personnel. Chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, soap, and perfume. Always the perfume struck the deepest chord. It was the most impractical gift, the most unnecessary, the most purely symbolic. You could not eat perfume. You could not trade it effectively on the black market. It served no survival function. It was simply beautiful and luxurious and unnecessary. And its very existence in an American soldier's pack spoke to an abundance that German nurses had been told was impossible. The historical record preserves many examples of this phenomenon. Dr. Ernst Müller, who worked as a surgeon in a hospital in Thuringia, noted in his journal that American soldiers seemed to carry more personal items than German soldiers were allowed in their entire barracks. Cigarettes by the carton, chocolate bars in every pocket. One American lieutenant, he noted with something between admiration and disbelief, had a portable phonograph and a collection of jazz records that he played in his quarters. Another had a camera and seemed to photograph everything. The abundance was not limited to officers. Even the enlisted men had more material goods than German officers. They threw away food that German civilians would have fought over. They discarded equipment that still worked simply because newer versions had arrived. Dr. Muller watched American engineers bulldoze a supply dump of slightly outdated boots, hundreds of pairs of boots, burned because they were last year's model, and there was no point in storing them. This was the power that had defeated the Reich. Not merely military power, though that was overwhelming, but the power of an economic system that could produce such absurd surpluses that it could afford to be wasteful, that could ship perfume to the front lines, that could give chocolate to enemy nurses while simultaneously dropping thousands of tons of bombs on enemy cities. The perfume bottle became a symbol of transformation, both personal and ideological. For the German nurses, it marked the moment when the propaganda dissolved and reality reasserted itself. They had been told that the Americans were coming to rape and pillage, to take revenge for Hamburg and Dresden. Instead, the Americans came with penicillin and sympathy. They came with questions about supply needs and offers to help. They treated German patients alongside their own. When Captain James Morrison of the Army Medical Corps took over a hospital in Bavaria, his first action was to order hot food for the entire staff, German and American both. He had a cook unit prepare a meal using American rations: canned beef, real bread, vegetables, coffee with sugar and condensed milk. The German nurses sat at tables in the hospital courtyard and ate until some of them became sick because their shrunken stomachs could not handle the richness of the food. Sister Elizabeth Koch, who had worked without a day off for 14 months, who had held the hands of over 300 dying soldiers, who had not tasted real coffee in 4 years, sat in that courtyard with tears streaming down her face, a cup of American coffee in her hands, and felt something break inside her. Not her spirit, that had broken long ago. What broke was the lie that she had served something noble, the lie that the suffering had meaning, the lie that the enemy was inferior. The Americans who gave her that coffee were not supermen. They were boys mostly, with Midwestern accents and poor German, and a tendency to chew gum constantly. But they represented something that the Third Reich could never have created: a society wealthy enough to care about the comfort of its soldiers, stable enough to maintain supply lines across an ocean, confident enough to show mercy to defeated enemies. The perfume bottle, the chocolate bar, the soap that smelled of lavender. These were the weapons that destroyed the last vestiges of National Socialist ideology more effectively than any bomb. The transformation was not immediate or universal. Some nurses clung to the old beliefs, insisting that the Americans were simply trying to trick them, that the true horror would come later. Some remained bitter, unable to forgive the destruction of German cities, the deaths of German soldiers. But for many, the kindness was destabilizing in a profound way. It forced a reckoning with questions they had been avoiding. If the Americans were not the monsters they had been described as, what did that make the Reich? If the enemy could afford to give perfume to those who had served against them, what did that say about the ideology that had led Germany into this abyss? Sister Margarethe, who had received that first bottle of perfume from the red-haired soldier from Ohio, kept it on a shelf in her room for the rest of her life. She never used it. The bottle became a kind of shrine, a marker of the day the world changed. She would later tell her niece that she kept it as a reminder that she had been wrong about everything she thought she knew. She had been wrong about the Americans. She had been wrong about the war. She had been wrong about the Reich. The perfume bottle was her evidence that belief, no matter how fervent, could not change reality. Other nurses did use their perfume. They dabbed it on their wrists during night shifts when the smell of infected wounds and death became too overwhelming. They used it sparingly, making the small bottles last for months, for years. Some traded it on the black market for food for their families. Some gave it to their daughters or sisters, passing on not just the perfume but the story of how they received it. The story of the day the Americans came with gifts instead of guns. The perfume entered the mythology of the post-war period. In the chaos of occupied Germany, when cities were rubble and the future was uncertain, the story of American soldiers giving perfume to German nurses became a parable told in kitchens and refugee camps and displaced person centers. It was a story about unexpected grace, about the possibility of moving past hatred, about the strange mercy of the victors. It was not the only story, of course. There were other stories, darker ones about violence and exploitation and the rough justice of occupation. But the perfume story persisted because it pointed toward a different kind of future. One where German and American might coexist not as mortal enemies but as something else. The material abundance that the perfume represented was not accidental. It was the product of a political and economic system that the National Socialist ideology had fundamentally misunderstood. The Third Reich had been built on the assumption that nations competed for limited resources, that power came from conquest, that the future belonged to those willing to take what they needed by force. Lebensraum, living space, was the driving concept. Germany needed land, resources, slaves. It needed to expand or die. This was presented as an iron law of history. The American system operated on different principles. It was built on abundance rather than scarcity, on production rather than plunder, on the assumption that wealth could be created rather than merely redistributed through conquest. This was not altruism. American capitalism was brutal in its own ways, exploitative, unequal, but it had unlocked a productive capacity that the world had never seen before. American farms produced so much food that the government paid farmers to leave fields fallow. American factories produced so many goods that advertisers had to constantly create new desires to absorb the surplus. American workers, even in wartime, had access to consumer goods that European aristocrats might envy. This abundance was visible in every American supply dump, every ration kit, every care package sent from home. German soldiers who were captured often reported that they ate better as prisoners of war than they had as active Wehrmacht troops. American POW camps served meals that German soldiers had not seen in years: meat, fresh vegetables, white bread, coffee, desserts. Some German prisoners actually gained weight in captivity. This was not because the Americans were particularly generous to prisoners. It was simply that the baseline of American provisions was so high that even the minimum met or exceeded what the Wehrmacht could provide to its own soldiers. The nurses saw this disparity in stark terms. They watched American medics work with equipment that seemed like science fiction compared to what the Germans had been using. Portable X-ray machines, abundant antibiotics, blood plasma that saved lives that would have been lost under the German system. American field hospitals had sterilization equipment, proper lighting, backup generators. German hospitals by 1945 were operating by candlelight, reusing bandages washed in questionable water, rationing morphine so strictly that men screamed through amputations. Sister Anna Hoffman recorded in her diary that she watched an American medic throw away a pair of surgical scissors because they were slightly dull. Throw them away. In the German hospital, those scissors would have been sharpened and resharpened until the metal wore through. Nothing was discarded. Everything was salvaged, repaired, reused until it literally fell apart. The American capacity to treat equipment as disposable was almost offensive in its extravagance. And yet, Hoffman admitted, the American wounded recovered faster. They had fewer infections. They survived injuries that would have killed German soldiers. The abundance translated directly into saved lives. The perfume bottle thus became a synecdoche for this entire system. It was the most frivolous element of American abundance. And yet it was perhaps the most powerful symbol, because it represented the luxury of caring about things beyond survival. A nation that could ship perfume to the front lines was a nation that had so thoroughly won the economic war that it could afford to think about morale, about beauty, about the psychological well-being of both its own soldiers and its defeated enemies. This was power of a kind that the Third Reich had never imagined, much less cultivated. The ideological implications were profound. The National Socialist worldview held that struggle was purifying, that hardship built character, that a people softened by comfort would inevitably fall to a people hardened by discipline. The perfume bottle suggested the opposite might be true. A people confident in their abundance might be stronger, not weaker, than a people trained in scarcity. A soldier who knew that his country could provide him with coffee and chocolate and letters from home might fight more effectively than a soldier motivated purely by fanaticism or fear. A nation that could afford to be generous to defeated enemies might build a more stable peace than one that imposed only punishment and extraction. These were radical thoughts for nurses who had spent years immersed in a different ideology. Some rejected them, some couldn't process them, but many found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they knew about power and strength and national greatness. The perfume bottle sitting on a shelf or carried in a pocket was a constant reminder that the world was larger and stranger than the Reich had told them. The symbolism of the perfume extended beyond mere material abundance. It carried cultural and gendered meanings that resonated powerfully with the nurses. Perfume represented femininity, beauty, civilian life, all the things that had been devalued or suppressed by a militarized totalitarian state. The Third Reich had its own ideas about women's roles. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Women were to be mothers and homemakers, bearers of racially pure children for the Reich. There was honor in this role, the propaganda insisted, but it was a circumscribed honor, a domestic honor. When the war consumed Germany's men, women were pressed into service in ways that contradicted the official ideology. They became factory workers, farm laborers, streetcar conductors, and they became nurses, tens of thousands of them, working in conditions that would break anyone regardless of gender. These nurses had sacrificed their femininity as they understood it. They cut their hair short because they had no time to maintain it. They stopped wearing makeup because there was none to be had. And even if there were, it would have seemed absurd to paint one's lips while surrounded by dying men. They wore shapeless uniforms and wooden clogs. Their hands became rough and scarred. their bodies thinned to the point of gauntness. They learned to suppress their emotional responses, to harden themselves because constant exposure to trauma would otherwise destroy their sanity. In the process, they lost something of themselves. The war had ground them down, turned them into machines for processing suffering. The perfume bottle was an invitation to remember who they had been before. It was a suggestion that femininity and beauty still had a place in the world, that the war had not permanently destroyed the possibility of grace. This was deeply moving to women who had not thought of themselves as women, in that civilian sense, for years. Sister Greta Weiss, the former art student, wrote in a letter to her cousin that when she finally opened the perfume bottle that Private Chen had given her, she spent an hour simply sitting and smelling it, remembering what it felt like to be a person who cared about such things. "I had forgotten," she wrote, "that I was once a girl who loved beautiful things. I had forgotten that there was a world where such beauty existed." This gendered aspect of the gift was significant because it represented a different model of society. The Americans, for all their own contradictions and prejudices, came from a culture that had not completely militarized femininity. American women worked in factories and joined the military. Yes, but they also maintained a civilian identity. American soldiers carried photographs of girlfriends and wives who wore lipstick and dresses. American magazines, even during wartime, advertised cosmetics and fashion. The perfume bottle suggested that it was possible to wage war without entirely subsuming civilian life into military necessity, that a society could be both powerful and beautiful, both strong and humane. The German nurses had been taught that such softness was weakness. The Americans demonstrated that it might be strength. A nation confident enough to care about perfume was a nation that had not been consumed by existential terror, that had not sacrificed everything to the war god. This was an uncomfortable realization for women who had been told that their sacrifices were necessary, that the hardship was noble, that they were serving the highest possible cause. If the Americans could win while maintaining space for beauty and frivolity, what did that say about the necessity of German suffering? The epilogue of these encounters played out over the decades that followed. The nurses who received perfume from American soldiers carried the memory with them through the rebel years of occupied Germany, through the division of their country, through the long process of reconstruction and reckoning. Some married American soldiers and moved to the United States, where they discovered firsthand the material abundance that had seemed so impossible. Some remained in Germany and rebuilt their lives in the shadow of their wartime experiences. All of them carried the knowledge that the enemy had been different than advertised, that the war had been built on lies, that the ideology they had served had led only to destruction. Sister Margaret died in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell. She was 84 years old. The perfume bottle still sat on her shelf, the liquid inside long since evaporated, leaving only a faint residue and a memory. Her niece, who inherited her effects, donated the bottle to a small museum dedicated to the post-war occupation. It sits now in a display case alongside other artifacts from that period. Chocolate bar wrappers, Lucky Strike cigarette packs, a Stars and Stripes newspaper from May 1945, announcing Germany's surrender. The label explains its provenance and significance. Visitors sometimes stop and stare at it, this small glass bottle that represents so much. The transformation that the perfume symbolized was both individual and collective. Individual nurses wrestled with their complicity in a criminal regime, with their own culpability or innocence, with the question of what they could or should have known. The perfume did not absolve them of these questions. It did not make them innocent, but it did offer a path forward, a suggestion that redemption might be possible, that people who had been enemies might find common ground in shared humanity. This was not a comfortable revelation. It would have been easier in some ways if the Americans had been the monsters the propaganda described. Then at least the moral universe would have remained simple. Instead, the Americans came with perfume, and the moral universe became complicated. This complication was perhaps the most valuable gift of all, though it took many of the nurses years to recognize it as such. The certainties of the Third Reich had led to catastrophe, a more nuanced understanding of the world, a recognition that enemies could be human and that ideology could be wrong, might lead somewhere better. The perfume bottle thus became a quiet monument to the possibility of change. Not radical change. The occupation had its own brutalities, The Cold War brought new divisions, and Germany's reckoning with its past would be long and painful. But the small change of person-to-person recognition, the acknowledgement that even in war there could be moments of grace, the understanding that abundance and generosity might be more powerful than scarcity and fanaticism, these were the lessons carried in a glass bottle that smelled of roses and jasmine. Decades after the war, researchers conducting oral histories with German medical personnel found that the perfume story was one of the most commonly told. Even nurses who had never personally received perfume knew the stories, had heard them from colleagues, had internalized them as part of the narrative of how the war ended. The gift had taken on a mythic quality, representing not just American abundance but the possibility of moving past hatred, of finding humanity in unexpected places, of building something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. One historian noted that the perfume bottle functioned as a counter-narrative to the dominant story of the occupation. Where official histories focused on military strategy, political negotiations, and the mechanisms of denazification, the perfume bottle represented an alternative history of small gestures, personal transformations, and the slow rebuilding of trust. It was a woman's history, largely invisible to the grand narratives of military and political history, but no less significant for that invisibility. Sister Elizabeth Koch, who had broken down crying over a cup of American coffee, lived until 2003. In her final years, she gave a series of interviews to a graduate student researching women's experiences in wartime. She spoke about the perfume. In her case, it had been a small vial of evening in Paris and what it had meant to her. It was proof, she said, that the world I remembered had not been entirely destroyed. There were still places where people made beautiful things for no reason, except to make people happy. That seemed impossible in 1945. Everything was destroyed. Everyone was dead or dying. And then this soldier, he couldn't have been more than 20 years old, gives me this bottle of perfume. And I realized that somewhere far away, there were factories making perfume, and stores selling it and women buying it, and life going on as if the world hadn't ended. It gave me hope that maybe we could have that again someday. Maybe not the Reich, I didn't want that anymore, but normal life. Ordinary beauty, small pleasures, peace. This was the deepest transformation the perfume represented, the restoration of hope. Not hope in some grand ideological project, not hope in national greatness or racial destiny or any of the other abstractions that had led Europe into catastrophe, but hope in the possibility of ordinary human life continuing, of a future where people could care about perfume, because they were not constantly fighting for survival. This modest hope was perhaps more revolutionary than any political ideology, because it suggested that the purpose of society was not to achieve glory, but to enable human flourishing, to create the conditions under which people could live, not as heroes or martyrs, but simply as people. The American soldiers who handed out perfume would have been bemused to learn that their small gestures carried such weight. To them, it was just being decent, just treating people like people. This casual decency, this unremarkable kindness, was itself a kind of power. It was the power of a society that had not been totalitarianized, that had maintained space for ordinary human gestures even in the midst of total war. The perfume bottle was evidence that democracy, for all its flaws and contradictions, had preserved something that fascism had destroyed. The assumption that people were entitled to small pleasures, that beauty had value, that generosity was not weakness but strength. In the end, the perfume bottle stands as a symbol of the profound irony at the heart of the Second World War's conclusion in Europe. The Reich that promised glory and greatness delivered only suffering and annihilation. The democracy that the Reich despised as weak and decadent proved strong enough to cross an ocean, liberate a continent, and show mercy to defeated enemies. The perfume bottle, with its scent of roses and jasmine, carried the message that freedom and abundance were not luxuries that made a nation soft, but foundations that made it powerful. This was a lesson written not in the grand sweep of military campaigns, but in the small moment when a young soldier placed a glass bottle in a nurse's hands and smiled. And she understood that everything she had been told was a lie, and the truth was somehow both more terrible and more hopeful than she had imagined. The perfume bottle still sits in its museum case, a small relic of a transformative moment. Visitors lean close to read the label, trying to imagine the weight of meaning carried in so small an object. And sometimes, very rarely, an elderly woman will stand before it with tears in her eyes, remembering a gift she received 80 years ago, remembering the moment when the world changed, remembering the scent of roses and jasmine and the strange, overwhelming kindness of enemies who became, in that instant, something else entirely, something human, something like hope.